Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Critical Thinking Through English Composition. This is the makeup lecture for the two classes that we're going to be missing today, which is October the 1st, and also October the 3rd, the Tuesday and Thursday classes. Okay, let's get started. Pardon me. Now, in today's class, I'll be going over making an analogy and assignment. So the first thing I'll be doing is doing a quick review of what it means to make an analogy. When you make an analogy, what you're doing is you're making a comparison between two subjects, and this is usually done to try and highlight certain similarities. This is often done when you are trying to say that two things are alike in certain specific relevant ways, so therefore you can draw a further conclusion about these similarities. Sometimes you want to show that two seemingly unrelated things share some sort of commonality. You might remember from our last class, I showed you the meme from the movie Forrest Gump, where the main character says that life is like a box of chocolates. These are two things that are seemingly unrelated: human life and a box of sugary chocolate treats. The point of that analogy is that there's a distinct, relevant similarity between these two seemingly unrelated things. When you choose a chocolate from a box of chocolates, you might not be sure what type of chocolate you're going to get. Quite often, the insides of these chocolates are quite different. Some might have nuts, others might have caramel, others might have some sort of strawberry sauce or something else. And as a result, there's always a surprise regardless of what you choose. This is somewhat similar to life in that you don't always know what you're going to get when you make certain choices in life. There isn't really a significant conclusion that you could draw from that, other than that perhaps it's a note on how these two seemingly unrelated things do share a kind of surprising commonality. But in other cases, analogies are used for a very specific purpose. You might say that A and B are alike in a few relevant ways, and they should be alike, or they could also be alike in another significant way. You could also recall from our lecture last week where we talked about the Russian astronaut who said that women in Russia are perfectly capable of being very good railroad workers in her country. So why can't they be perfectly good astronauts as well? She was obviously talking about the need for increased female participation in her nation's space program. Now, obviously, in the 1950s and 60s, there were perhaps more similarities between railroad work and the space program than there might be now. It was technical knowledge that was required, but it was much different and on a much less developed level than the astrophysics that we have now. Also, I think the idea is if women are able to gain technical knowledge in this one field and prove themselves worthy of employment in it, then they should also be able to show that they are equally well suited for this other, also important work in their country's destiny. Analogies can also be used sometimes when we make predictions. For example, if we look at a certain kind of technology from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, and you might say, well, if you take a look at the level of development of a certain type of technology from, let's say, 20 years ago, and you compare that state of technology from 20 years ago to how it is now, if you want to make a prediction into the future, you might say, well, if you take a look at how far technology has come, especially a specific type of technology, how far it has come in the last 20 years, well, then you might try to make some sort of prediction about where that same technology will be 20 years in the future. using the previous 20 years as a model. If you can see a certain dramatic jump in technological development from 20 years ago until now, you might say, well, the technological development that we've had in the last 20 years, we can expect that to happen in the next 20 years as well. So therefore, we can make some predictions, hopefully, on where that type of technology will go. Technology, or not, sorry, not technology. Another good analogy, which I'd like to begin today's class with, is related to grading. Whenever I describe grading to students, there's the absolute grading versus grading on a curve. When a course is graded according to an absolute grading scale, what it's doing is saying that it's very much like grading on, oh, just one moment here, just technical difficulty for a second. Okay, sorry. When you do absolute grading, that's very much like driving school. You know, when you have 10 people take a driver's test, for example, if everybody is able to meet a certain basic minimum requirements, then they can all pass and get, their driver's license. And there's nothing preventing everybody from achieving that. Everybody can get a driver's license. Everyone could possibly get 100% on the test. Whereas grading on a curve, you're not going to be graded according to some sort of absolute standard, but you are being graded in relation to other people. So, for example, if you have a race, it doesn't matter how well a person does individually, doesn't matter how fast they run. What matters is how fast they run in relation to the other people. And this is very similar to grading on a curve, where it doesn't matter whether the majority of students get above 90% or below 90%. Grading on a curve is very much like a race. And people that reach the people that finish the race first are very much like people that will finish a course with the highest 30% of the grades. It doesn't matter what that final grade actually is in terms of the percent. The only thing that matters is that their final percentage is above the 70% of the remaining students. In that way, grading on a curve is very much like grading on a curve is very much like a race, whereas absolute grading is very much like getting a group of people together to take a test with an absolute standard, like the test for a driver's license. Now, I think both of these analogies are good and that they show certain strengths and weaknesses of both grading practices. I personally, let me go back here for a second, having taught both, going back, let me go back to the previous one, there we go. Having taught courses both on an absolute grading versus grading on a curve, I have seen the strengths and weaknesses of both of these approaches to education, and I could talk about these at length if you would like. Although I tend to prefer absolute grading because it focuses on the individual accomplishment of students, I do also think that it is somewhat unrealistic in the sense that in society, we are in competition with others for a limited number of resources, and perhaps it should be part of the education system to prepare students for this eventuality. Of course, there are other sides to that argument as well. When we make analogies, it's important to keep in mind that you're saying that something is like something else. You're not saying that it is 100% comparable. And actually, the only similarities that are really important are the ones that are relevant for the analogy. If I could go back to the analogy that life is like a box of chocolates, no accent required for that. then the only thing that is important are the relevant similarities between choosing from a box of chocolates and the life changes or the life decisions that we make as we go through this plane of existence. Every analogy is going to have its weaknesses. And when somebody says that something is very much like something else, it's very easy to point out that, well, these two things may have similarities. They are not alike in this way. And that difference might be relevant. And this is where it's important that we take a look at the relative strengths and the weaknesses of an analogy and try and judge, well, which are stronger? Are the relevant similarities stronger, or are the relevant differences more significant? And most importantly, are those similarities relevant enough for the purpose of the analogy? Are those similarities relevant enough to help us understand what the person is trying to say when they make a comparison between one thing and something else? Okay, so let's go back to one of the examples that I prepared. Here we go. A store owner, we did this one in class last week. A store owner had an unusual way of deterring shoplifters. When he caught one, the shoplifter threatened to call the police unless the shoplifter gave him a shoe. After giving up a shoe, most shoplifters were too embarrassed to return to the store. The police used the following argument to stop the owner from doing this. So the police made an analogy. Demanding a shoe in return for not calling the police is like demanding $20 for not calling the police. Both actions involve threatening someone to give up something of value. And if you threaten someone to give up something of value, that's a form of robbery. So it would be a form of robbery to demand $20 in return for not calling the police. Therefore, it is a form of robbery to demand a shoe in return for not calling the police. This obviously results in the store owner not being able to demand from potential shoplifters that they give him a shoe instead or in lieu of him not contacting the police. Now, this analogy obviously has a couple of strengths and weaknesses, and we can take a look at the following paragraph where someone tries to gauge the relative strengths of those strengths and weaknesses of these similarities and differences. So let me go through here. Okay, yeah, so after you take a look at an analogy, it's important to ask yourself, is the analogy relevantly similar? How are these similarities significant to the conclusion? For example, are these similarities relevant enough that it makes the conclusion a strong argument? How are these two things different? And how is each different relevant to the strength or weakness of the conclusion? Is the difference strong enough or relevant enough to weaken the overall argument so that we can say it's not a very good analogy at all? Do the similarities outweigh the differences, or do the differences outweigh these similarities? Let's take a look at this paragraph and see how it outlines these various similarities and differences, and then makes an evaluation on which is stronger or which is weaker. So this is a fairly strong argument because demanding $20 and demanding a shoe are relevantly similar. So this is saying that the analogy the police made is a strong analogy. Both involve threatening the shoplifter with harm, in this case, arrest, for shoplifting, unless they give something of value. Since threatening someone to give you money is what makes mugging a form of robbery, this similarity is relevant to the conclusion that demanding a shoe is robbery. There is a relevant difference, however. This is important. So remember, every analogy will have a number of different relevant similarities, also relevant differences, and it's a matter of trying to evaluate, are the similarities and their relevance greater, or are the differences greater, therefore weakening the analogy. So there is a relevant difference. However, the store owner could spend the $20, but he can't do anything with one shoe. This is obviously a very relevant difference. The store owner is not trying to uh, obtain some sort of personal gain by getting the $20. The point of this $20 is not to try and get some sort of financial compensation or to take that money and then spend it. The point is simply to deter the shoplifter from coming back to the store. Yeah, this is relevant because it makes it clear that the owner's goal is not personal gain, but to deter shoplifting. That is a relevant difference. Nevertheless, that difference does not change the fact that demanding a shoe is relevantly like robbery, since giving up a shoe is still a loss for the shoplifter. In both cases, the shoplifter is losing something of value, and compelling someone to lose something of value, whether it is a shoe or whether it is $20, that is the more relevant similarity. Taking money by force is still robbery. Yeah, even if the robber donates it to charity or some other selfless act, you're still forcing the or compelling the shoplifter to give up something of value. Okay, now I just want to sort of focus here on the structure of the paragraph, because this is what I'm going to ask you to do when you complete your second writing assignment. The first sentence here, the green sentence, this is a fairly strong argument because demanding $20 and demanding a shoe are relevantly similar. This one sentence tells us the writer's overall evaluation of the analogy. Is it fairly strong? Is it fairly weak? In this case, the writer is stating that it's fairly strong, and says that these two things, demanding $20 and demanding a shoe, are relevantly similar. Then we have the next couple of sentences in purple, and here we get a description of the relevant similarities. Both involve threatening the shoplifter with harm, in this case arrest, unless they give something of value. And since threatening someone to give you money is what makes money a form of robbery, this similarity is relevant to the conclusion that demanding a shoe is robbery. Okay, those two sentences are looking at the similarity of demanding a shoe and demanding $20. After those two sentences, the writer then shifts to discussing a relevant difference. And there is a relevant difference here. There is a key difference between $20, which the store owner could spend on something that they wanted, and a single shoe, which has no financial value to the owner. Now, there was a student in class that pointed out there are some marketplaces on the internet where you can buy and sell a single shoe, but I don't think that is relevant for this example. So the store owner could spend the $20, but he can't do anything with one shoe. Now, that's the big difference. Why is that relevant? So first tell me the difference, and then give me a short explanation for why it's relevant. This is relevant because it makes it clear that the owner's goal is not personal gain, but simply to deter shoplifting. Now that the writer has looked at both the similarities and the differences, we get the writer's final evaluation. Nevertheless, that difference does not change the fact that demanding a shoe is relevantly like robbery, since giving up a shoe is still a loss for the shoplifter. And that's the most relevant similarity in this case. Demanding $20 and demanding a shoe. Giving up a shoe is still a loss. Demanding $20 would also be a loss. And taking money by force is still robbery. even if the robber donates it to a charity or some other selfless act. So it wouldn't matter whether the store owner took $20 and then donated it to charity. That wouldn't change it. And in this case, the store owner demanding a shoe, although they're not going to use it for any sort of personal gain, they are still demanding something of value, still insisting that the shoplifter give up something of value, in this case, the shoe. And that's the most relevant similarity. Okay, here's another analogy which I'd like you to consider. Imagine walking by a shallow pond and you see a young child drowning. You can save the child at no risk to yourself, but you would ruin your shoes. If you don't do anything, the child will die. It would be wrong to let the child die to avoid ruining your shoes, but we all do something like this every day. We could save the lives of children in developing countries by donating relatively small amounts of money to organizations like Oxfam or CARE. Not donating money to organizations like these is like letting a child drown in a shallow pond. Therefore, it is wrong not to donate to international relief organizations. Okay, now in this analogy, someone is making a comparison between watching a child drown in a shallow pond and not donating to international aid organizations like Oxfam or CARE. Now, how relevantly similar are these two things? Watching a child drown in a shallow pond, where you could save the child without any physical danger to yourself, and letting children die in developing countries by not donating small amounts of money, meaning you would not be sacrificing anything financially, really, in order to make such a donation to a charity. Something to keep in mind. This is one of the examples that I would like you to keep in mind when I give you your homework assignment at the end of today's lecture. I'm going to ask you to take one of the analogies that I used in this lecture and then relative weakness of that analogy. This is the first example. So if you'd like to choose this one and then write a paragraph similar to the paragraph about the evaluation of the analogy of the store owner, demanding that the shoplifter give up a shoe, and the police said that was like forcing the shoplifter to give up $20. Remember, after that, there's the paragraph. Write a similar paragraph about this analogy. Or if you don't like this analogy, here's another one. The universe is like a house in that every part of the house appears to be carefully and skillfully designed for some purpose. In a house, for instance, the steps of the stairs are designed at exactly the right height and size for humans to walk up them. Likewise, we find in nature all kinds of things that are perfectly suited for some creature or another to use in some way. But you will notice that whenever we see a house, we can be confident that it has some creator. Likewise, we should infer that the universe as a whole has some creator. Obviously, this is the argument from design, stating that if you take a look at a house, or actually any sort of physical structure made by a man, you can infer that it was made because there are certain specifications to that structure that clearly imply it was designed for a certain purpose. For example, a staircase was designed at the right height and size for people to walk up them. Likewise, according to this analogy, the universe has also likely been designed by a creator, because there are many things that we can see in the universe which also seem to imply that they were designed for particular creatures to use in a particular way. Okay, and here is the last one. This is an America-centric one. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States does not protect the right to shout fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. During a war, handing out pamphlets that encourage people to resist a military draft is like shouting fire in a crowded theater, in that both present a danger to the public. Therefore, the First Amendment does not protect the right to distribute anti-draft pamphlets. Okay, I'm just going to stop here for a moment. This argument that is being made here, with a very specific analogy of shouting fire in a crowded theater, is one that has a historical context, and it's important that I give you a little bit of background in order to understand the situation. Otherwise, this analogy will probably seem quite confusing. Okay, so very quickly, the Constitution of the United States does allow for freedom of speech. And one issue that has come up a number of times throughout the history of the United States is, to what extent, if any, should the freedom of speech be limited? Are there any situations in which someone should not be allowed to exercise their right to free speech? And this is a case where a judge on the court decided that there are limits to when somebody should be prevented from exercising their right to free speech. Okay. Now, in this case, there were a group of immigrants that were distributing anti-war material during World War I. So this was between 1914 and 1918. So Europe is involved in a very great war. And when I say great, I don't mean wonderful. I mean great in size. Was the largest military conflict in Europe up to that point in world history. And these immigrants on, I believe, the streets of New York were distributing pamphlets, and they were encouraging people not to accept the draft. The draft was a compulsory military conscription. So men had to go to Europe to fight in World War I when the American government decided to join that conflict. When these men were arrested and brought to court, the men claimed that they were exercising their right to free speech. They argued that in the United States, everyone has the right to free speech, so therefore they had a right to distribute written material that discouraged people from signing up for the draft to go and fight in Europe. Now, in this case, the judge said that there is a time when we can limit somebody's right to free speech, and he gave the example of shouting fire in a crowded theater. According to the judge, shouting fire in a crowded theater creates a danger to the public. I mean, if you shout fire in a crowded theater, especially when there is no fire, then you can cause panic. And in the panic, some people could be injured or even killed. If everybody runs to the exit, some people could get trampled and then killed. shouting fire in a crowded theater creates a danger to the public, and the right to public safety is more important than the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is this important, but the right to public safety supersedes that right. Therefore, shouting fire in a crowded theater is not protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The judge then said that what these men were doing by distributing material, written material, that discouraged people from going to fight in World War I, this was similar to shouting fire in a crowded theater. How is it similar? Well, during a war, handing out pamphlets that encourage people to resist the military draft creates a danger to the public. I mean, the country could lose the war. So it's like shouting fire in a crowded theater and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. Now, there are certain things with this analogy that we could point out. For example, the conflict itself was not in the United States. So you might argue that the World War in Europe was not one that created a clear and present danger, and therefore the men who were discouraging people from signing up for the draft might not actually have been doing the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. Some years ago, I also discovered that the men were also distributing these pamphlets that encouraged people to resist the military draft. The pamphlets were not written in English. Apparently, they were written in Yiddish, I think, which was a language that most people on the streets of the United States could not read. So how strong was this analogy? The idea that freedom of speech can be restrained is one that has been brought up a number of times since then. So although the original case for shouting fire in a theater might not have been seemingly such a strong analogy at the time, the idea that people should not be able to say something which could create public harm has been one that has been brought up a number of times throughout history. And okay, and moving on. Okay, now here's another analogy. So imagine that you are a movie producer and you want to produce a new movie that's based on Dora the Explorer. It's the popular children's television series. You've already reached an agreement with the original voice actors, and you've found a great animation team as well as a well-known director of children's movies. Now, if you wanted to construct an analogy that might convince a major studio to financially support your movie, what would you do? Well, what you might want to do is make a comparison with a previous television series that was turned into a successful movie. And then say, if you see how this other example of a television series was transferred to a movie form, well, if we do this with Dora, it will likewise be as successful. So here's an example of an analogy that could be made. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie was quite successful. It grossed about $140 million worldwide. A Dora the Explorer movie would be like the SpongeBob SquarePants movie in that it is based on a long-running television series, relevant similarity, so we know a lot of people will like it. Like SpongeBob SquarePants, Dora the Explorer also sold a lot of toys and other merchandise, second relevant similarity. So we know that people are willing to spend money on Dora. And like SpongeBob SquarePants, the Dora movie would feature the original voice actors which is important for winning over fans of the TV series. Okay, that's a third relevant similarity. This brings us to the conclusion. Therefore, the Dora movie would also be extremely successful. So by using the SpongeBob SquarePants example, the person is trying to draw an analogy and say that making a movie version of Dora the Explorer would be similarly successful. Okay, and here's a final analogy for everybody. As students, I hope you'll appreciate this one. So imagine a department store, and let's say this department store offered a shopping spree for $5,000. So if you pay $5,000, you could walk into the department store and you could take anything, even expensive designer products. If someone paid the fee, the $5,000, and then they left with only a chocolate bar, they would be acting foolishly. University students that choose easy courses are similar. After paying tuition, students can learn anything. Instead of looking for the most valuable learning experiences, these students, choose mental chocolate bars offered by the easiest courses. Therefore, students who choose easy courses instead of the most stimulating courses are acting foolishly. So in this case, the analogy is between paying for a department store shopping spree and only walking out with a chocolate bar, and going to university, but only choosing the easiest courses, because in both cases, the person is acting very foolishly. They're not getting very much for the money that they pay. I really like that one. Okay, and we're getting close to the end here. Okay, now if we have time next week on the 8th, I might do this as a quick exercise at the beginning of our class. Suppose your friend has downloaded many movies without paying for them. Has your friend done something wrong? Or is it okay to download movies without paying for them? Construct an analogy to argue yes or no. So the topic here is downloading or piracy. Is this wrong? Can you make an analogy to argue that downloading movies without paying for them is okay or not okay? So there is an ethical argument to be made here. Or I guess technically a legal one if you're going to argue that it's not actually theft. Number 2, many countries have laws requiring people to wear helmets while riding motorcycles. Should it be illegal to ride a motorcycle without a helmet? Construct an analogy to argue yes or no. I think this is another interesting one. So here you're going to compare riding a motorcycle with riding a bicycle. Some countries obviously say that it's illegal to ride a motorcycle if you don't have a helmet. Should countries also do the same with riding a bicycle without a helmet? How similar or different are these two things? Once again, we need to take a look and see, are the similarities relevant and are they stronger than the differences that you can find between these two subjects? Last of all, some people would say that an activity or lifestyle should be avoided because it is unnatural. For example, people should not be vegetarians because humans naturally eat an omnivorous diet. Omnivorous meaning eat everything. So humans naturally eat both plants and animals, where we can eat pretty much anything. Show that this is a flawed argument with a relevant analogy. Yeah, in this case, I'm looking for a very specific type of argument. If somebody tries to say that vegetarianism is unnatural because people naturally eat a very diverse diet of both and uh, meat and plants, they'll try to say that it is unnatural. Try to show that this is a flawed argument with a relevant analogy. Might be interested to see what you can come up with there. Something else that we might do at the beginning of our class is to put you into groups, and I might ask you to choose two things that you think are comparable in some significant way. And then maybe create an analogy that shows how they are similar in at least one relevant way, and two, that they could be similar in another way. So if something is similar in this way, then how might it be similar in another way? Thinking back to the example of the Russian astronaut who said, if women in Russia can be great railroad workers, well, then they should also be able to be great astronauts as well. Okay, and now it is time for your homework. I'm now going to go back, and I want to give you 3 choices to choose from. There we go. 3 choices to choose from. And then from that, I want you to write a paragraph of about 150 words, similar to what I have here. So earlier in the lecture, I talked about how this paragraph evaluates the relative strength and weaknesses of the similarities and differences with one of the following analogies. Okay, so the first analogy that you could choose from is the one about walking by a shallow pond, seeing a young child drowning. You can save the child at no risk to yourself, but you'd ruin your shoes. If you don't do anything, the child will die. It would be wrong to let the child die to avoid ruining your shoes, but we all do this every day. We could save the lives of children in developing countries by donating relatively small amounts of money. Not donating to organizations like these is like letting a child drown in a shallow pond. If you choose this analogy, we'll then write a paragraph of about 150 words. Tell me your overall impression of the analogy. Then tell me about the specific similarities, the relevant differences. And finally, tell me why you think the analogy is relatively strong or weak. Okay, the second example here is about the universe is designed like a house. So this is a creation from design argument. Read the paragraph again and then decide whether you think this is a relatively strong or weak analogy, and write a paragraph of 150 words. Okay, this one I talked about in detail about the First Amendment. Sound fire in the theater, relevant similarities, did that. Okay, your third choice, here we go. If you don't want to do the child drowning in a shallow pond or the universe must have a creator, here's something that you might find a little easier to relate to. And this is the analogy that compares walking out of a department store shopping spree that you've paid $5,000 for with only a chocolate bar, and paying tuition, and then instead of looking for the most valuable learning experiences, just taking the easiest courses that are offered. And the conclusion here obviously being that in both cases, the person is acting foolishly. How strong or weak is this analogy? Take a look at the similarities and differences. Which do you think are stronger? Are the relevant similarities between these two things stronger, or the relative differences? Okay, just hold on a moment here for a moment. Here we go. Okay, so I just wanted to finish up our class with a couple of things. There is a really interesting speech that was given at a university in Canada by a man named Christopher Hitchens. And he talks about the importance of freedom of speech. And at the very beginning of his speech, he references the limitation on the freedom of speech that the judge mentioned many years ago about if there is someone in a crowded theater, they should not have the freedom of speech to yell fire. because it could endanger public safety, and therefore the right to public safety is greater than the right to freedom of speech. Very culture specific thing there. I think this is one of the best public speeches that I've heard on the topic of freedom of speech. And I like how at the very beginning he actually says, fire, fire, fire. Okay, now I've said it. And then he goes on. I don't agree with everything that Mr. Hitchens says in this speech, but I think as an example of very well executed oratory or very well performed public speaking, I think it is a masterclass. So I'll just leave that there. If you want to click on the link, you can find the PPT on Cyper Campus. You don't have to. I'm not going to mention it in class, but when I was younger, he was definitely one of my favorite public intellectuals. Okay. Just about at the end here. So for homework, a couple of things. Obviously, the paragraph, which I want you to write about 150 words. Choose one of those three examples that I just gave you, and then write a paragraph that evaluates the relative strength or weakness of that analogy. And also, please take a look at chapter 4. This is arguments from authority. We'll be taking a look at using experts in your arguments very soon. We can hear this very often, and we use it quite often in our own arguments too. If you are talking to somebody and you want to tell them what you're saying is relevant, it's very easy to say, look, you don't have to take my word for it. And then you point to someone that is an authority, some kind of expert in the topic. How can you use an expert's words well when you reference them as a source? What should you be careful of when you hear somebody reference an expert, and how can you be sure that they are an expert? Well, these are things that I'll be talking about a little bit later in the week. Hold on. Okay, so yeah, please make sure that you read chapter 4, Arguments from Authority. That's from pages 23 to 31. And I think I'm just about finished. So just one last quick look at the paragraph that I would like you to model your homework on. So yeah, choose one of the following analogies and write a paragraph that evaluates the strength of that particular analogy. Is the analogy relatively strong or weak, relatively similar? How are they different? How are the differences relevant to the strength or weakness of the conclusion? And finally, do the similarities outweigh the differences or vice versa? What is your final evaluation? Is the analogy relatively strong or weak? So try to think of those 3 examples. Okay. And yeah, one more time, if you just wanted to see that paragraph. This is the model paragraph. I would like your writing to be quite similar. So whether you choose, comparing the shopping spree and then walking out with only the chocolate bar to taking only the easiest courses in university, or the example of the child drowning in a shallow pond to not donating to a charity, or the third other one. It's up to you. Okay, so this second assignment will be due on by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. I'm looking for approximately 150 words. Please don't attach a separate file. Just copy and paste it into the box, and that should be fine. All right, so I hope you have enjoyed the lecture. So, let me just make sure to stop sharing the screen. I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. If you have any questions, please post them in the group chat on Cacao Work, and I look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday. All right. Enjoy your time. Bye-bye.